More drama tonight in the battle over opening the new Gordie Howe Bridge. Congressional Democrats say they are launching an investigation into President Trump's threat to delay the opening over potential conflict of interest.
So there's a call for answers following a reported meeting between the owner of the Ambassador Bridge and U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, a meeting that the New York Times reports happened just before Donald Trump took to Truth Social to say he will block the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge.
U.S. lawmakers just stepped in, and what they did may have shut down any path for Trump to interfere with one of North America's most critical trade crossings. Because what started as a political threat aimed at a bridge quickly spiraled into something far bigger. Allegations of billionaire influence, monopoly protection, and federal power being used to tilt the economic playing field. At the center of the storm sits the Gordie Howe International Bridge, a multi-billion-dollar trade corridor connecting Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan. Built to handle thousands of trucks a day, the crossing is designed to strengthen supply chains, cut congestion, and add redundancy to one of the busiest commercial arteries in the world. But the fight surrounding it isn't just about infrastructure. It's about control. For decades, heavy commercial traffic across the Detroit River has been dominated by a single crossing, the privately owned Ambassador Bridge. That bridge, controlled by a wealthy Detroit-based family, has effectively functioned as a near monopoly for truck freight moving between the two economies. Every 18-wheeler hauling auto parts, machinery, and agricultural goods across this corridor has depended on that privately controlled route, which meant toll revenue, tens of millions annually, flowed through one gatekeeper. The Gordie Howe Bridge changes that equation completely. It introduces publicly governed competition into a corridor that has operated under private dominance for generations. More lanes, direct freeway connections, faster customs processing, and most importantly, an alternative route that breaks single bridge dependency. For monopoly holders, that's not just competition, it's revenue erosion. And that's where the political controversy ignited. Reports surfaced that the owner of the existing bridge held a private meeting with a senior government official. A meeting that immediately raised red flags among lawmakers monitoring infrastructure policy and cross-border trade. The concern wasn't casual lobbying, it was timing. Because not long after that discussion, Donald Trump publicly signaled he was considering blocking or interfering with the new bridge's opening. To many in Washington, that sequence set off alarm bells. The fear wasn't simply that Trump opposed the bridge, it was that federal authority might be used to protect a private monopoly from public competition. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle began scrutinizing whether economic influence was bleeding into federal decision-making, especially given the bridge's national security and supply chain importance. Because this crossing isn't symbolic. Nearly a quarter of all merchandise trade between the United States and Canada flows through the Detroit-Windsor corridor. The North American auto industry, one of the most integrated manufacturing systems in the world, depends on uninterrupted freight movement here. Components cross the border multiple times before a finished vehicle rolls off an assembly line. Any disruption, political or structural, ripples instantly through factories, logistics networks, and consumer markets. Which is why congressional reaction moved quickly from concern to action. Lawmakers began pushing legislative safeguards designed to prevent political interference from halting or delaying the bridge's activation. The goal wasn't just to protect a construction project. It was to firewall critical infrastructure from private influence and executive pressure. Behind closed doors, officials framed the issue in national resilience terms. Relying on a single privately owned freight crossing creates vulnerability. Mechanical failure, protests, or geopolitical tension could choke supply chains overnight. The new bridge adds redundancy, a second artery, ensuring commercial continuity even if one route is disrupted. Blocking it in that context wouldn't just protect private revenue. It would preserve a structural weak point in continental trade logistics. That strategic framing reshaped the debate inside Washington in a decisive way. The conversation moved beyond the immediate question of whether the bridge should open on schedule and instead zeroed in on institutional authority. Lawmakers began examining whether any administration, regardless of party, should hold unilateral power to obstruct infrastructure that had already cleared regulatory review, secured international permits, locked in financing, and reached near completion. The concern wasn't abstract. If executive discretion could be used to stall a fully authorized by national trade corridor, it would set a precedent extending far beyond a single project. Attention quickly shifted toward structural safeguards. Congressional committees and policy staff began exploring legislative mechanisms that could firewall critical cross-border infrastructure from political disruption once formal approvals were granted. The objective wasn't to strip the executive branch of oversight entirely, but to narrow the window for intervention. After treaties were honored, funds committed, and construction finalized. In practical terms, that meant reinforcing presidential permit protections, codifying project continuity once binational agreements were ratified, and limiting the scope of last-minute national security or trade justifications being used to halt activation. The legislative push now unfolding reflects a broader institutional signal. Trade corridors of this magnitude are not transactional assets. They are systemic infrastructure embedded in continental economic architecture. By moving to constrain interference, Congress is asserting that once projects reach operational readiness under existing legal frameworks, they transcend shifting political agendas. Continuity, not volatility, is the governing principle when supply chain resilience is at stake. Because once operational, the Gordie Howe International Bridge will move far more than vehicles across the Detroit River. It will channel industrial output from assembly plants, agricultural exports from interior supply networks, and time-sensitive manufacturing components feeding synchronized production cycles. It will carry commuter labor-sustaining cross-border employment ecosystems and facilitate defense-linked materials moving within North America's integrated security manufacturing base. Each category represents a logistical stream whose stability affects production forecasts, cost modeling, and strategic planning on both sides of the border. That operational reality reframes the confrontation entirely. What appears outwardly as a dispute over infrastructure scheduling is at its core a question of governance over economic lifelines. Interruptions at crossings like this don't remain localized. They propagate through procurement contracts, labor shifts, inventory systems, and export commitments. Even temporary disruptions can generate cascading inefficiencies measured not in days, but in quarterly output losses. Which is why lawmakers rejected the premise that this episode was ever just about whether a bridge opens this year or next. The deeper issue was whether private economic influence, amplified through political access, could shape federal infrastructure outcomes. After formal agreements were already locked, it also raised the question of whether executive leverage could override decade-old international frameworks, built on shared financing, negotiated ownership, and reciprocal economic benefit. With congressional intervention now advancing, the balance of authorities surrounding the project appears to be shifting back toward institutional continuity, reinforcing the principle that once binational infrastructure reaches completion thresholds, its activation should proceed under rule-based governance rather than political recalibration. But the episode leaves behind a broader strategic lesson that extends well beyond this crossing. In modern geopolitics, infrastructure is no longer passive. Bridges, ports, rail corridors, pipelines, and digital cables function as arteries of economic security. Control access to them, or threaten to, and you wield leverage that rivals tariffs or sanctions in downstream impact. So, when billion-dollar trade arteries intersect with private monopolies and presidential authority, the conflict stops being about engineering timelines or toll structures. It becomes a contest over who controls the movement of commerce itself and who holds the power to decide when those flows accelerate or stop.